They once stood beneath stadium lights, with tens of thousands singing every word back to them. Their names dominated radio playlists, tour posters, and chart rankings. For a moment, it felt permanent. But country music has never been gentle with its heroes. Trends shifted, labels moved on, and the applause slowly faded. In this video, we revisit 11 country stars who went from stadiums to silence. Artists who filled arenas at their peak, only to disappear quietly from the industry they helped build. Johnny Rodriguez. At his peak in the early 1970s, Johnny Rodriguez represented something country music had rarely seen before. A young singer from Texas with a smooth baritone and unmistakable charisma, he didn't just break onto the charts. He exploded. Between 1973 and 1978, Rodriguez delivered a string of #1 hits, sold out major venues, and became one of the most played voices on country radio. At a time when arena shows were becoming the new standard, his name appeared prominently on tour posters alongside the genre's biggest stars. Rodriguez's rise was historic. He was widely recognized as the first major Latino superstar in country music, and for a brief moment, it seemed the industry was ready to embrace a broader future. His records blended traditional country with emotional vulnerability, and audiences responded instantly. Promoters trusted him to draw crowds. Labels invested heavily. From the outside, his career looked unstoppable. But the cracks appeared quietly. As the late 1970s approached, country music began to change its priorities. The sound grew slicker, radio playlists tightened, and labels became more cautious. Rodriguez's style, once seen as heartfelt and authentic, was suddenly considered risky. Albums received less promotion. Singles stalled lower on the charts. The arenas filled more slowly, then not at all. Unlike many fallen stars, there was no single scandal that ended his momentum. Instead, there was silence. Tour offers dried up. Radio moved on to newer voices. Industry support evaporated without explanation. For an artist who had once been treated as a symbol of progress, the withdrawal felt especially cold. By the 1980s, Johnny Rodriguez was no longer a stadium act. He continued performing, but far from the massive crowds that once defined his career. His influence remained undeniable, yet his name slowly disappeared from retrospectives, award shows, and mainstream country narratives. New generations of fans rarely heard his songs, despite their former dominance. Rodriguez did not fail country music. Country music simply stopped listening. His story is not one of collapse, but of quiet abandonment. From the roar of packed venues to the hush of forgotten legacy, his journey captures exactly how quickly the industry can turn applause into absence. Mel McDaniel. In the early 1980s, Mel McDaniel was everywhere. His voice dominated country radio, his songs packed dance floors, and his name was a reliable draw on large tours across the United States. When Baby's Got Her Blue Jeans On became a massive hit, McDaniel crossed the invisible line between respected artist and full-fledged country star. Promoters booked him confidently, knowing his music connected instantly with working-class audiences who filled arenas night after night. McDaniel's appeal was rooted in simplicity. His songs were upbeat, relatable, and built for live performance. At a time when country music was expanding into bigger venues, his sound fit perfectly. He wasn't chasing trends. He embodied what mainstream country wanted to sell: fun, familiarity, and mass appeal. For several years, that formula worked flawlessly. His records climbed the charts, and his touring schedule reflected an artist at the center of the genre's commercial engine. But success built on radio friendliness can be fragile. As the decade progressed, country music began to pivot again. The industry leaned toward more polished images, crossover ambitions, and younger faces. McDaniel's straightforward style, once a strength, suddenly felt out of step. Singles stopped climbing as high. Albums received quieter releases. The attention that once surrounded him began to thin. There was no dramatic collapse, no headline-grabbing scandal, no public feud. Instead, McDaniel experienced something far more common and far more brutal in the music business: indifference. Radio slowly replaced his songs. Tour slots shrank. His name, once a selling point, became optional. By the late 1980s, the arena crowds were gone, replaced by smaller venues and nostalgia bookings. McDaniel continued performing for years, but the scale of his career had permanently changed. His biggest hits lived on in jukeboxes and memory. Yet the industry rarely acknowledged the role he played in defining an era of country entertainment. He wasn't erased overnight. He simply faded out of the conversation. Mel McDaniel's story illustrates how quickly momentum can vanish when an artist's identity becomes tied to a specific moment in time. He filled stadiums when the industry needed him, and when it moved on, it did so quietly. From roaring crowds to near silence, his career followed a path that many country stars know all too well. T.G. Sheppard. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, T.G. Sheppard was not just successful. He was dominant. Few country artists could match his consistency on the charts, and even fewer could translate that success into packed arenas. With a long run of #1 hits and an unmistakable, smooth vocal style, Sheppard became one of the most bankable names in country music. Promoters trusted him. Radio relied on him. For a time, his presence on a tour poster practically guaranteed strong ticket sales. Sheppard's rise aligned perfectly with the industry's push toward larger venues and broader audiences. His music blended traditional country storytelling with a polished, contemporary sound that worked equally well on radio and on stage. He wasn't positioned as an outlaw or a rebel. He was the professional hitmaker, dependable, and commercially powerful. Throughout the early 80s, his career seemed locked into a stable upward trajectory. Then the landscape shifted. As country music moved deeper into crossover ambitions, image-driven marketing, and younger demographics, Sheppard's carefully crafted sound began to feel tied to a previous era. The change was subtle at first. Singles didn't stall completely, but they stopped reaching the very top. Album promotion became quieter. The industry didn't reject him outright. It simply stopped prioritizing him. This was the most dangerous position for a star to be in. Sheppard had done nothing wrong. There was no scandal, no creative collapse, no public controversy. Yet the momentum that once carried him from arena to arena slowly drained away. Tour sizes shrank. Media attention drifted elsewhere. New voices filled the radio slots he once owned. By the late 1980s, T.G. Sheppard was no longer a stadium-level act. He continued to perform, releasing music and maintaining a loyal fan base. But the scale of his career had permanently changed. His earlier dominance faded from mainstream memory, even though his chart record remained one of the strongest of his generation. Sheppard's story captures a quiet truth about country music's evolution. The industry doesn't always destroy its stars. Sometimes it simply outgrows them. One decade, you define the sound of the genre. The next, you're standing just outside the spotlight, watching it move on without you. From sold-out arenas to relative silence, his journey reflects how easily greatness can be left behind. Moe Bandy. For a long stretch of the 1970s, Moe Bandy was one of the most dependable names in traditional country music. While others chased trends, Bandy stood firmly in the honky-tonk tradition, delivering heartbreak songs that resonated deeply with working-class audiences. His records sold steadily, his singles climbed the charts, and his touring schedule was relentless. Night after night, he played to packed houses, often sharing large stages with the era's biggest country stars. Bandy's appeal was authenticity. His voice carried the sound of bars, jukeboxes, and long drives home after midnight. At a time when stadium country was still rooted in emotional storytelling, that authenticity mattered. Promoters trusted him because fans trusted him. He wasn't a novelty act or a short-lived hitmaker. He was a fixture. His presence on a lineup signaled real country music, not spectacle. But the very thing that built his success slowly worked against him. As the late 1970s turned into the 1980s, country music began to favor smoother production, crossover potential, and carefully managed images. The industry's priorities shifted toward artists who could appeal beyond the traditional base. Moe Bandy did not change, and the industry noticed. Radio airplay became less consistent. Albums received less promotional support. Tour billing quietly moved him lower on the poster. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no dramatic fall from grace, just a gradual distancing. The stadium-sized crowds disappeared first, then the larger theaters. Eventually, even the industry conversation stopped including his name. Unlike many artists, Bandy never truly left music. He kept recording, kept touring, and maintained a loyal audience that appreciated what he represented. But loyalty doesn't replace industry backing. Without radio support and label investment, the scale of his career narrowed sharply. What had once been a nationwide presence became regional, then nostalgic. Moe Bandy's silence wasn't the result of failure. It was the result of timing. He belonged to a version of country music that the industry decided to move past. His story highlights one of the genre's harshest realities. Staying true can cost you visibility. When the spotlight shifted, it didn't dim slowly for Bandy. It simply moved on. From full venues echoing with heartbreak anthems to a career sustained quietly on the margins, Moe Bandy went from stadiums to silence, not because audiences stopped caring, but because the industry stopped listening. Eddie Raven. In the early 1980s, Eddie Raven stood at the crossroads of creativity and commercial success in country music. He wasn't just a performer. He was a songwriter, a studio innovator, and one of the few artists who managed to blend traditional country storytelling with a modern, radio-friendly sound. When his singles began climbing the charts, Raven quickly transitioned from respected insider to headline attraction, drawing large crowds and securing prime tour slots across the country. At his peak, Raven's music was everywhere. Songs like I Got Mexico and Driving My Life Away dominated country radio, and his energetic performances made him a reliable draw for large venues. Promoters viewed him as a safe bet. He appealed to traditional fans while also reaching younger listeners, a balance the industry desperately wanted during a period of rapid expansion. For a moment, it appeared Raven had unlocked the perfect formula for long-term relevance. But that balance proved fragile. As the decade progressed, country music's commercial center began to harden. Radio playlists became more restrictive, labels less patient, and stylistic boundaries tighter. Raven's willingness to experiment, once celebrated, started working against him. His sound no longer fit neatly into the industry's increasingly narrow definitions of what country should be. The decline didn't arrive with a crash. Singles charted lower but didn't disappear. Albums were released, but promotion felt muted. Tour schedules thinned gradually, then sharply. Behind the scenes, support faded. Radio moved on to artists who better matched the emerging formula. Raven, who had once symbolized evolution, now seemed out of place in the very genre he helped modernize. By the late 1980s, Eddie Raven was no longer filling large venues. He continued recording and performing, but the scale had changed permanently. His earlier hits lived on, yet his name was rarely mentioned in conversations about defining figures of the era. Industry recognition evaporated quietly, leaving behind an artist still working, but largely unheard. Raven's story reveals a subtle cruelty of the country music business. Innovation is encouraged only until it becomes inconvenient. Once the rules shift, yesterday's forward thinker can quickly become today's outsider. Eddie Raven didn't lose his talent, his drive, or his audience. He lost the industry's attention. From packed venues echoing with his songs to a career carried on without spotlight or celebration, his journey reflects how easily progress can be forgotten once silence replaces applause. Rex Allen Jr. Rex Allen Jr. grew up surrounded by fame, but he didn't rely on his name alone. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he carved out a successful career that spanned country music, television, and film. With a clean-cut image and strong stage presence, Allen became a familiar face to mainstream audiences. His music charted well, his acting roles kept him visible, and his live performances regularly drew large crowds. For a time, he stood comfortably within the industry's inner circle. Allen's versatility was his greatest asset. He could headline concerts, appear on television specials, and transition seamlessly between music and acting. This made him especially valuable during an era when country music was expanding beyond radio into broader entertainment spaces. Promoters viewed him as dependable. Networks trusted him. His career trajectory suggested long-term stability rather than short-lived stardom. But the industry changed faster than his image. As the 1980s progressed, country music began to narrow its focus. Television opportunities faded, musical tastes shifted, and crossover appeal became harder to sustain. Allen's style, once seen as broadly accessible, started to feel out of step with the genre's evolving identity. He wasn't controversial enough to stand out, nor edgy enough to be reinvented. The withdrawal was gradual but decisive. Acting roles became less frequent. Music releases received minimal attention. Tour opportunities shrank from headline slots to supporting appearances, then to smaller venues altogether. There was no public explanation, no dramatic turning point. The industry simply stopped calling. Unlike artists whose careers collapse under scandal or self-destruction, Allen's fade was almost invisible. He continued working, continued performing, and remained professional throughout. But without institutional support, visibility vanished. New generations of country fans grew up unaware of how prominent he had once been. By the time his career reached its later years, Rex Allen Jr. existed largely outside the mainstream conversation. His earlier success was rarely revisited, and his contributions were seldom acknowledged in retrospectives of the era. The silence surrounding his legacy was not earned through failure, but through neglect. Allen's story highlights one of country music's quietest tragedies. Even artists who do everything right can be left behind when the industry no longer sees a use for them. From major stages and television screens to near total obscurity, his journey reflects how easily success can dissolve into silence once the spotlight moves on. Tom T. Hall. At the height of his career, Tom T. Hall occupied a rare position in country music. He wasn't just a star. He was a storyteller revered by the industry itself. Known as the storyteller, Hall wrote songs that felt lived in, intimate, and sharply observant. His records sold in massive numbers, his shows filled large venues, and his words shaped the emotional vocabulary of country music throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. When Hall was on a bill, audiences didn't just come to be entertained, they came to listen. Hall's success was built on honesty. He wrote about ordinary lives with extraordinary clarity, turning small moments into universal truths. That authenticity translated powerfully on stage. His concerts drew crowds who wanted more than spectacle. They wanted meaning. At his peak, Hall stood comfortably among the genre's giants, both commercially and artistically. But unlike many stars who are pushed out, Hall chose a different path. As the industry grew louder, faster, and more image-driven, he became increasingly disillusioned. Country music, once centered on storytelling, was shifting toward polish and formula. Hall did not hide his discomfort. He questioned the direction of the genre, the commercialization of radio, and the loss of space for quiet, thoughtful songs. Gradually, he stepped away, not in rebellion, but in retreat. He reduced touring, limited his public presence, and distanced himself from the machinery of the industry. The stadium stopped filling, not because audiences rejected him, but because he no longer wanted to stand beneath those lights. In an industry that rewards constant visibility, absence quickly turns into erasure. By the 1980s, Tom T. Hall was largely gone from the mainstream conversation. His influence remained embedded in the songwriting of others, but his own name faded from headlines and award stages. New fans discovered country music without ever being introduced to the man who had defined its narrative depth. Hall's silence was voluntary, but the industry's response was not gentle. Once he stepped out of the cycle, there was little effort to preserve his presence. His legacy lived quietly in lyrics, not in celebration. From sold-out venues to self-imposed distance, his journey reflects a different kind of disappearance. Tom T. Hall didn't burn out. He walked away. And in doing so, he revealed how quickly country music moves on, even from the voices that once taught it how to speak. Lee Greenwood. For a period in the 1980s, Lee Greenwood stood on some of the biggest stages country music could offer. His voice carried across massive venues, his songs became fixtures at large-scale events, and his name was associated with national moments that reached far beyond the genre itself. Greenwood wasn't just a successful country artist. He was a symbol. When his music played, it filled stadiums and unified crowds in a way few performers could achieve. At his peak, Greenwood enjoyed extraordinary visibility. Major tours, television appearances, and high-profile performances placed him firmly in the upper tier of country stardom. Promoters knew he could command large audiences, and his presence on a bill guaranteed attention. For several years, he operated in a rare space where commercial success and cultural relevance overlapped. But that visibility came with a hidden cost. Greenwood's identity became increasingly tied to a specific image and theme. While that association initially amplified his reach, it also narrowed it. As country music shifted toward new narratives, younger artists, and more diverse subject matter, Greenwood's role within the industry began to feel fixed in the past. Radio programmers hesitated, labels recalibrated. The spotlight slowly drifted elsewhere. The transition was quiet. There was no public rejection, no abrupt fall from grace. Greenwood continued to perform, continued to record, and remained respected. Yet the scale changed dramatically. Stadium bookings faded, major tours disappeared. His music, once omnipresent, became ceremonial rather than central. He was still invited, but no longer essential. This kind of fade is particularly harsh because it masquerades as honor. Greenwood was never disgraced. He was simply repositioned. The industry framed his work as symbolic rather than current, a tribute to an era rather than a living force within it. In doing so, it quietly removed him from the ongoing story of country music. As new generations of fans came along, Greenwood's name was mentioned less frequently. His achievements were acknowledged in passing, but rarely explored in depth. The roar of the stadiums that once defined his career gave way to selective appearances and quiet respect. Lee Greenwood's journey shows how country music can honor an artist while simultaneously moving past them. From commanding massive crowds to existing on the margins of relevance, his path illustrates a subtle truth. In this industry, even icons can slip into silence when their moment no longer fits the narrative being sold. Johnny Lee. At the start of the 1980s, Johnny Lee experienced one of the fastest and most dramatic rises in modern country music. With the release of Looking for Love, he didn't just score a hit, he captured a cultural moment. The song dominated radio, crossed over into pop charts, and became inseparable from the era's country identity. Almost overnight, Lee went from relative obscurity to performing in front of massive crowds, his name suddenly synonymous with commercial success. The momentum was overwhelming. Promoters rushed to book him. Major tours followed. Venues grew larger with each passing month, and audiences showed up expecting a star. For a brief period, Johnny Lee was exactly what the industry wanted. A marketable voice, a recognizable image, and a sound that could travel beyond country's traditional borders. Stadiums filled, applause came easily. But that kind of success is often built on a narrow foundation. Lee's identity became tightly linked to a single defining hit. While he continued to release music and record new material, the industry's expectations remained frozen in that moment of explosive popularity. When follow-up singles failed to replicate the same level of impact, patience disappeared quickly. Radio support weakened. Promotional budgets shrank. Tour slots became smaller and less prominent. The crowds that once came for a phenomenon began to thin. Unlike artists who fade gradually over decades, Johnny Lee's transition was swift and disorienting. One year he was a headliner. The next, he was struggling to maintain relevance in a market that had already moved on. There was no scandal to explain the fall, no public controversy to justify the retreat. The industry simply decided it had extracted what it needed. Without a second defining chapter, Lee was quietly sidelined. Stadiums turned into theaters. Theaters turned into clubs. Eventually, even those opportunities became inconsistent. Johnny Lee continued to perform, driven by love for music rather than industry validation. But the silence surrounding his name grew louder with time. New country fans often recognized the song without knowing the artist behind it. His role in shaping a key moment in country history became reduced to a footnote. His story is a stark reminder of how unforgiving the spotlight can be. Country music celebrated Johnny Lee loudly, briefly, and then moved on. From sold-out arenas to near invisibility, his journey shows how quickly applause can turn into absence once the industry decides a moment has passed. Jan Howard. For much of her career, Jan Howard stood on some of the most respected stages in country music. As a longtime member of the Grand Ole Opry, and a consistent chart presence during the 1960s and early 1970s, she was far from a minor figure. Her voice carried emotional weight, her songs connected deeply with audiences, and her name regularly appeared on major bills. When Howard performed, she wasn't filling stadiums through spectacle. She filled large venues through trust. Howard's success came from credibility. She was seen as authentic, resilient, and emotionally honest in a genre that valued lived experience. Her records sold well, her radio presence was strong, and her association with country's most prestigious institutions placed her firmly within the genre's core. For years, she was part of the establishment that defined what country music was supposed to sound like. But country music's relationship with its female stars has often been conditional. As the industry evolved, attention shifted toward younger faces and male-driven narratives. Radio playlists tightened, opportunity and women who had once been central were gradually pushed aside. For Howard, this shift wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and relentless. Her music didn't suddenly fail. Audiences didn't reject her. Instead, the system around her changed. Promotion slowed. New releases arrived with little fanfare. Tour placements moved her lower on the lineup. The venues grew smaller, then more symbolic than essential. While male peers from the same era were celebrated as legends, Howard's presence became increasingly overlooked. Despite this, she remained active. She continued performing, continued engaging with fans, and continued honoring the genre she helped build. Yet industry recognition faded. Retrospectives rarely centered on her contributions. New generations encountered country history with her name missing or briefly mentioned, if at all. By the later years of her career, Jan Howard existed largely in the shadows of a genre she once helped define. The roar of large audiences had been replaced by respectful but quiet appreciation. Her legacy survived through loyalty rather than visibility. Howard's journey reflects a painful truth about country music's memory. Being foundational does not guarantee being remembered. From major stages and institutional respect to near silence, her story captures how easily even essential voices can fade when the industry decides to move on. Larry Gatlin. At his peak, Larry Gatlin stood at the center of one of country music's most successful vocal groups. With the Gatlin brothers, he helped define the polished, harmony-driven sound that filled large venues throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their records sold in massive numbers, their songs dominated radio, and their live shows consistently drew thousands. For a time, Gatlin wasn't just popular. He was embedded in the industry's upper tier. Gatlin's talent extended far beyond performance. He was a gifted songwriter with a sharp ear for melody and structure, and his leadership shaped the group's identity. The Gatlin brothers weren't a fleeting trend. They were a dependable draw, trusted by promoters and embraced by audiences who filled arenas expecting precision and professionalism. Their name alone carried weight on tour posters. But as country music shifted in the mid-1980s, the environment that supported that success began to erode. The industry leaned toward younger faces, edgier images, and sounds that prioritized individuality over harmony. Vocal groups, once a major force, slowly lost their place in the commercial hierarchy. The Gatlin brothers didn't collapse. They were simply deprioritized. For Larry Gatlin, this shift was especially stark. As touring opportunities shrank and radio support weakened, the group's presence faded from mainstream visibility. Stadiums gave way to theaters. Theaters gave way to nostalgia circuits. The applause was still there, but it no longer echoed across the industry. What had once been central became peripheral. Gatlin continued to work, both musically and creatively. He explored solo projects, writing, and other ventures, but none matched the scale of his earlier success. The industry that once relied on his voice now treated it as a reminder of a previous era rather than an active force. Recognition became retrospective instead of current. Unlike artists undone by scandal or decline in ability, Gatlin's fade was structural. The system that elevated him evolved, leaving little space for what he represented. His contributions remained significant, but they were no longer spotlighted. New country audiences encountered the genre without fully understanding how dominant his presence once was. Larry Gatlin's story illustrates how success can evaporate without drama. One moment, you are filling large venues and shaping the sound of an era. The next, you are remembered quietly, if at all. From commanding stadiums with harmony and precision to existing outside the industry's main narrative, his journey completes the arc from overwhelming applause to enduring silence.